Welcome to the deep dive. We're not just looking back at history today. We're going to dive deep into the enduring questions that the life of Alexander the Great throws at us.
Right.
I think about it. What fueled his ambition? What does power do to a person? And just how far can one individual push the boundaries of what's humanly possible? We're going to try and unpack for you the core philosophical puzzles embedded in his story.
Yeah, and we've gone through a lot of fascinating writings about Alexander, specifically writings that examine him through this philosophical lens. So this isn't just going to be like a chronological march through battles and dates. We're trying to get at the fundamental ideas, the things that still resonate with us today, and give you a real shortcut to understanding this complex legacy.
Okay, so let's unpack this. A good place to start, I think, would be with the spark of his ambition. This wasn't some random occurrence. It feels like it was a very potent mix, a combination of the stories he was raised on, the education he received, and maybe some intense family dynamics.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, when you look at the sources, a few things really stand out. First, you have to consider his mythic identity. So, his mother, Olympias, claimed descent from Achilles. Can you imagine growing up with that ancestral connection? Like, here's this legendary hero, right? And you're supposed to be, descended from him.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a family tale, right? I mean, Alexander famously carried Homer's Iliad with him on his campaigns.
Right.
So it's not just like, oh, this is a nice book, this is fun. Like, this was a model for life, a conscious effort to embody the pursuit of Kleos. Now, Kleos is this ancient Greek concept of undying glory. So again, not just about conquering territory, but about achieving a legendary status that would echo through eternity, much like Achilles.
So he's literally living his life like he's a character in an epic poem.
Exactly.
It's no wonder he had this unquenchable thirst for kind of legendary achievement.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't all just myths and battlefield dreams, was it?
No.
The guy had a pretty rigorous intellectual upbringing.
That's right. So from the age of 13, he had a pretty famous tutor, Aristotle. Think about that pairing. One of the most brilliant minds in philosophy is shaping the intellect of this young man who goes on to be one of history's most transformative figures. So he's being immersed in ethics and logic and natural science, a really comprehensive education.
Right.
But what's really interesting and what I find fascinating is that even while he was absorbing all of this from Aristotle, Alexander actually diverged from him on a pretty significant point. Aristotle had this view of non-Greeks as being inherently inferior, and that really clashed with Alexander's worldview. He developed a much broader, much more inclusive vision, which we'll see later.
Yeah.
But I think that early divergence from Aristotle's thinking is really a key insight into his very unique approach to empire building.
Right. So even early on, you see him starting to forge his own path, even if it means disagreeing with this, incredibly influential teacher. Now, the sources also touch on a kind of intense Freudian idea,
Sure.
right? This concept of an Oedipus complex linked to his father, Philip II's assassination. Does that add just another layer of complexity?
Oh, absolutely. Because you have to look at kind of the psychological side of things, too. This theory suggests that intense rivalry with his father, combined with the sheer speed at which Alexander seized power after Philip's death in 336 BC, could point to a deep-seated need. It's not just to follow in his father's footsteps, but to really vastly outstrip him. And we know that Philip had ambitions to invade Persia, and Alexander really ran with that. He solidified his control in Greece and then launched that invasion on a massive scale. It makes you think, doesn't it? How all these different forces, his sense of self as this figure of destiny, this rigorous philosophical training, this complex family dynamic, all intertwined to ignite that initial ambition. Which part of that combination do you find most significant?
I think it's got to be that sense of himself as a heroic figure, combined with the intellectual tools to actually plan, strategize, and execute on that vision. It's not just this blind desire for glory. It's almost calculated. Okay, so we've got this incredible drive.
Yeah.
How does that translate into actually wielding power? Because wanting to conquer is one thing. Ruling effectively is something else entirely.
Yeah. This is where his story takes on a lot of nuance. He wasn't just this, military powerhouse. He was surprisingly good at blending this sense of, destiny with practical governance. A good example is the event at the Siwa Oasis in 331 BC. So the Egyptian priests declare him the son of Zeusmon, and he doesn't dismiss it. He totally embraces it.
That's like a masterclass in Pyrrhon, right?
Right.
Instantly gaining legitimacy in a whole new territory.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It immediately gives him credibility in a place with a totally different cultural and religious landscape.
Mm-hmm.
It allows him to connect with existing beliefs, right? Position himself as a divinely approved ruler. And it's interesting because this becomes a blueprint that later rulers will follow. I mean, you see it in the Roman emperors claiming divine favor as well.
Right.
So it's not just about military power. It's about, crafting an identity that resonates with the diverse people he's conquering.
And he didn't stop at just adopting those customs, did he?
No, he didn't.
The sources really point to these active efforts to blend cultures.
Oh, yeah, yeah. His marriage to Roxana, a Bactrian princess, that was a powerful symbolic gesture. But maybe even more so was the mass wedding at Susa in 324 BC, where thousands, literally thousands of Macedonian soldiers married Persian women.
Wow.
This wasn't just about political alliances. It was about fostering the sense of homonoia. Homonoia is unity. It's the shared identity, a sense of belonging across different peoples. And that really prefigures early ideas of cosmopolitanism.
It does sound very forward-thinking,
Yeah.
like a really enlightened approach to empire. But, the sources remind us that there's also this much darker side to his rule.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, the destruction of Thebes in 335 DC, the crucifixion of thousands in Tyre in 332 BC, these are brutal reminders that his vision of unity had very clear limits and that anyone who resisted was going to face terrifying violence.
Yeah.
So it really forces us to ask, how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory parts of his reign? Was his idealism genuine, or was it, in the end, just a means to an end, subordinate to the brutal necessities of controlling this huge, diverse empire?
Yeah, it's that chilling reminder, right, that even the people who articulate these high-minded ideals sometimes resort to extreme brutality to achieve and hold on to power.
Oh.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about what actually powered his expansion, that drive to conquer. How do we make sense of that philosophically, this insatiable hunger for more?
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting question. So when you look at his military campaigns through a philosophical lens, it's not just about recognizing his brilliance on the battlefield. Take Gaugamela in 331 BC. He uses this hammer and anvil maneuver, basically a cavalry charge, to create an opening for the infantry, right?
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Right.
But then you also have to think about the human cost, like that grueling march through the Gedrosian desert where he lost a third of his army.
Wow.
So it compels us to ask, how do we weigh this amazing strategic success against the value of human life?
It's a question that runs through so much of history, right? The price of ambition, both for those who have it and for the people who get caught up in it. And then there's that famous story from Plutarch about Alexander weeping because there were no more worlds to conquer.
Right.
That image always strikes me as so poignant.
It is, because it makes you think about his ambition in existential terms, Was it really about achieving specific goals, or was it more about the pursuit itself, that constant striving for victory? And does that lead to emptiness, even when you're outwardly successful? It's like Sisyphus pushing that boulder up the hill, right? No final summit.
And the moral lines seem to get blurrier as the conquests continue.
Yeah.
You think about the slaughter of the Mali, where he put himself in incredible danger, almost recklessly.
Yeah.
How do we interpret that kind of action?
That's an event that's ripe for philosophical debate. A Machiavellian perspective might say that this audacity, his willingness to be in danger alongside his troops was absolutely essential. It maintained loyalty, kept them moving forward, even when the risks were huge. But then a Stoic perspective might condemn that. Right? They would see this impulsiveness, this self-destructiveness, as a real failure of self-mastery, driven by, this excessive desire for glory rather than reason, virtuous action. So you see these totally contrasting ethical frameworks.
It's really fascinating. So he's conquering all this territory, but how did he deal with the practicalities of governing this massive empire? I mean, winning the battles is one thing, but creating something lasting, that's another challenge altogether.
Yeah, that's where his administrative side comes in.
Right.
And you see that he wasn't just about destruction. He actually understood how to organize, how to integrate his conquests. So he retained a lot of the Persian satraps, the local governors. That was politically really smart.
Right.
And then, of course, there are the cities he founded, over 20 of them, the most famous being Alexandria in Egypt.
And these weren't just, military outposts or anything, right? They were meant to be something more.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. These were centers for trade and for spreading Hellenistic culture. And this actually connects back to Aristotle, right? These urban centers with their grid layouts, their libraries, their theaters. It was this concept of the apolis, the city-state, as this vital center for life, for civic life. So he's exporting these Greek ideals of civilization.
Okay, so spreading culture, but how is all of this being funded?
Well, ultimately, conquest fueled further conquest. The sources are pretty clear about that. The looting of Persepolis Yeah, it was maybe sparked by a drunken impulse, but it gave him significant resources for his campaigns. And even when he adopts the Persian gold derrick as a standard currency, which is a good thing, it facilitates trade, it also had this direct link back to plunder. The economic engine of his empire at its core was taking what he could from those he conquered.
Which brings us to what might be an idealistic moment or might be a cynical one. His call for a brotherhood of man at Opus. How should we understand that?
That's a That speech is interesting. So, Opus, 324 BC, he advocates for harmony, a shared homeland between Macedonians and Persians. And it's a moment of real debate among historians and philosophers. Was it sincere? This expression of a cosmopolitan ideal, a belief in the potential for unity, for equality. Or was it a calculated political tactic? I mean, after all, his empire was huge, very diverse, and maybe Macedonian dominance wasn't enough anymore. So it begs the question, what are the real motivations behind these grand speeches?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that resonates even today, right?
Absolutely.
It's hard to tell the difference between genuine belief and political strategy.
Yeah.
Alexander's life, of course, is cut tragically short at the age of 32. What lasting impact did this whirlwind of ambition and conquest have? What are those echoes of his brief but impactful life that we still feel today?
Well, even though his empire fractured after his death, his successors, the Diadochi, divided it up. His cultural legacy was huge. This Hellenistic synthesis, this fusion of Greek culture and Eastern cultures, it spread from the Mediterranean all the way to India. Think about the Rosetta Stone, for instance, inscriptions in Greek and Egyptian. That's a really concrete example of this lasting cultural exchange.
So the political empire didn't survive, but his cultural influence was massive.
Hmm.
What about his impact on philosophical thought? How did thinkers after him deal with his legacy?
It's really varied, even contradictory. Stoics admired his cosmopolitanism. They saw him as someone who could transcend those narrow cultural boundaries. On the other hand, you have the cynics, like Diogenes. They really mocked his ambition, his materialism. Even later, you have Roman emperors who are trying to emulate him. And then you have Dante, who puts Alexander in the Inferno, a figure consumed by pride.
So really wide range of interpretations, from huge admiration to outright condemnation, and it still sparks debate, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. His life is still this incredibly potent case study when you're talking about leadership, about globalization, about, the ethics of empire. Think about Edward Said, his book Orientalism. He offered a pretty critical perspective on Alexander's so-called civilizing mission. He saw it as, a precursor to Western colonialism. On the other hand, you have historians like Robin Lane Fox, who are much more celebratory. They really highlight Alexander's vision, his ability to inspire, to achieve the impossible. So it really, makes you think about which interpretation you agree with.
It's that core tension, I think. That tension between his vision and the often brutal reality. That kind of ambition, that can drive these amazing achievements, but also cause so much suffering. It feels very relevant to us even today. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear Alexander's life is this profound exploration of ambition, and its consequences. We've looked at myth and reality, idealism and brutality, glory and emptiness.
And it makes me think of that quote from Curtius Rufus, "He filled the world with his fame, but could not fill his own soul." It's really poignant when you think about, the scale of his accomplishments, and yet that potential inner emptiness that his ambition might have created.
It forces you to reflect on our own aspirations, doesn't it? That constant striving for more. So we're going to leave you with a few questions to think about. Can ambition ever be truly ethical? Or is it inevitably tied to disregarding others? Does immense power always lead to some form of corruption, whether it's of yourself or your ideals? And as we pursue our own sense of significance, what parts of our shared humanity might we be losing along the way? Alexander's story, with all its complexity, definitely gives us a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.